Hundreds of Palestinians are fleeing parts of Gaza City after Israel began the first stages of a planned ground offensive. The UN's calling for an immediate ceasefire to avoid what it says will be inevitable death and destruction. Israel's military says it has a hold on the outskirts of Gaza City as it begins the first stages of its plan to capture and occupy the area. Explosions were seen in northern Gaza overnight as the military bombardment of the area continued. Israel's described Gaza City as a Hamas stronghold, but the United Nations has characterised the plan as systematic destruction of Gaza's largest city. The French President Emmanuel Macron's warned this week that the offensive can only lead to disaster for both people and risks plunging the entire region into a cycle of permanent war. The Israeli military said on Wednesday that around 60,000 reservists are being called up for the beginning of September to free up active duty troops for the ground offensive. Brigadier General Elfi Devrin said the Israel Defence Forces are already making advances under phase 2 of what he has described as Operations Gideon's Chariots.
We will deepen the damage to Hamas in Gaza City, a stronghold of governmental and military terror of the terrorist organization. We will deepen the damage to the terror infrastructure above and below the ground and sever the population's dependence on Hamas.
Let's get the latest on all of that by going live to Jerusalem and joining our Middle East correspondent Yolande Nell. So Yolande, we know that this offensive has now begun. First of all, let's talk about Palestinians on the move, because hundreds of thousands of Palestinians potentially in the line of that conflict.
That's right. Ultimately, the Israeli military says it's going to tell the entire population of Gaza City to move to new tent camps in the south. But we're not expecting the offensive to get to that stage for several weeks. What we're seeing at the moment is that Israeli forces have advanced in recent days on the edges of Gaza City, in the east of the city. People are really fleeing towards the west from those eastern neighbourhoods, particularly places like Zeitoun, which again we're told by locals saw heavy shelling by Israel overnight. And I think what we're seeing from Israel at the moment is that it's signalling that it wants to press ahead with this big military offensive to conquer all of Gaza City, despite the intense international condemnation that there has been of its plans. So we've seen a lot of rhetoric in the past day. The Israeli military saying after it ordered that big mobilization of reservists that it had started the first stage of its attacks. You had the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu coming out saying that he'd shortened the timeline for this operation to take Gaza City, but without specifying what that timeline would now be. And this, of course, is all increasing pressure on Hamas as well. Hamas put out its own statement saying, accusing the Israeli leader of waging a brutal war on the civilians in Gaza City, but also criticising him for blatant disregard of the new ceasefire efforts that mediators have put forward, Qatar and Egypt. After Hamas signed up to this, Israel has yet to give a formal response to this new ceasefire and hostage release deal that is on the table. We have got Israeli media reports saying that the Israeli minister who's in charge of the negotiations file did meet with Qatari officials in Paris and reiterated this position that Israel is no longer ready to accept what it calls a phased deal with only some of the hostages being returned. It wants all of the hostages to be returned at once. It wants a comprehensive deal and for Hamas to surrender on its terms.
Yolande, does this now mean then, given that this offensive is continuing at pace, that the ceasefire talks are really in doubt now, or any possible ceasefire is unlikely to be imminent?
Well, I mean, Israeli media are saying that it's unlikely at this stage that a new round of indirect talks will take place, that Israel will send a negotiations team. But, you know, this is all part of the pressure as well. And mediators have assessed that because it will take some weeks for this military offensive to begin in full, those reservists are not being told to turn up for active duty until September. They see that there is still a window of opportunity to push here for a deal. And the Qataris have been saying that although it is a 60-day ceasefire that's again being talked about with the return of only some of the 20 Israeli hostages believed to be held alive in Gaza, that there is a pathway here to a comprehensive deal.
OK, Yolande now monitoring developments in Gaza from Jerusalem. Thank you very much for that update. Well, let's speak now to Rosalia Bollen, the UNICEF spokesperson for Gaza, who's responsible for coordinating UNICEF's humanitarian efforts in the occupied Palestinian territories, including, of course, Gaza. Welcome to BBC News, Rosalia. First of all, what are your teams on the ground in Gaza City saying to you right now? Because as we heard from Yolande just then, there are thousands and thousands of people who are potentially at risk at the moment now. They are being told to move, but of course the question is, where would they go to as well?
Yeah, and that is really the crux of the question. Where would these 1 million people who are left in the northern part of Gaza and Gaza City and surroundings go to? The guest house of UNICEF where I typically stay is in southern Gaza and Al-Mawasi. And when I get out of the guest house and you drive through that area, as far as the eye stretches, what you see is makeshift tents. The overcrowding is immense. Already right now, it's a beachy, dune-like area without urban infrastructure that is very heavily overcrowded. What we are seeing right now on the ground is an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. We are really at the worst point in this war because of unprecedented levels of hunger, of diseases spreading. 1 in 3 persons in Gaza has gone days without eating. Malnutrition among children below 5 has increased by 500% between February and July this year. And in parallel, we see these diseases spreading. There's an outbreak of meningitis. There's a reported outbreak of Guillain-Barré syndrome. We have lots of children who suffer from diarrhea, other waterborne diseases, skin diseases. So we're looking at a very vulnerable population who has lived through 22 months of relentless bombardment, with the exception of February when we had a ceasefire, and also staggering levels of deprivation and suffering.
And Rosalia, one thing that it would be good to understand, given that your teams do work on the ground, so Israel will issue an evacuation order, but of course, as we've just discussed, the challenge is where can people go? And of course, it means them leaving their homes, and many of the people have been displaced a number of times. What support, if any, can you provide for people who are constantly on the move? And of course, the challenge is trying to get aid in the first place.
Absolutely. Gaza is such a frustrating environment to work in as a humanitarian because we see how deep the needs are. Families don't have the basics to survive, and there's a shortage of everything: food, clean water, medicine, tents, shelter material, clothes. Most of the children that we come across, they wear dirty, torn clothes. They look hungry, all of them. They ask for maya, for water. And so we know what the needs are. We know what needs to happen. And for instance, UNICEF has the equivalent of 2,000 trucks worth with life-saving supplies that we could mobilize and bring in. But restrictions on aid persist. We have been allowed to bring in some select items, some nutrition supplies, some products that we use to treat water, to make water drinkable, but we're unable to bring in the full range of our supplies, and we're also unable to bring in supplies at scale, because what Gaza needs today, the entire population is hungry. We need a mass influx of humanitarian aid and commercial goods. We see a catastrophe unfolding right underneath our noses. Okay. You've seen the deaths that have been reported in relation to malnutrition and starvation. We have been warning about this for months, and we now see really the worst case scenario materializing, unfortunately.
Rosalia Bollen, thank you so much for sharing your insights as that offensive continues on, and of course highlighting the plight particularly of children.